Leslyn and Siobhan head up onto the front, and hopefully the audio is coming through just fine on the. No, they've got microphones. Anyway, so welcome everybody. We do this meetup that we've got people who are watching as well, so that's why I'm talking into the funny microphone. We're doing this as a quarterly thing, and we're bringing in smart and fun people. You guys get to decide which one of you is fun and which one of you is smart. Right? Okay, let me go over here. But without further ado, this is Leslyn Keith and Siobhan Huggins. They're going to be talking about, well, lipedema and lymphedema, I'm assuming as well. If you want more information about either of those, it's in the description of the video. So without further ado, here we go.
Okay, thank you so much for Chris and Miriam for having us come out here and talk to you about this incredibly important topic that you may not know anything about, but when you leave here, you will hopefully know a lot about. So we're going to be talking about lipedema, what it is, give you a management overview, and how does keto help. So just to give a quick introduction of us, I'm Leslyn Keith. I'm an occupational therapist, and I spent about 20 years treating lymphedema and lipedema. I am the director of research and the president of the board for the Lipedema Project. And I consult with another organization, Lipedema Simplified. I've written 2 books on how keto can help with lymphatic disorders. And they're on the back table over there. And I have a lifestyle program for people who have lymphatic disorders and they want to maybe control their weight and control their lymphatic disorder. We encourage a ketogenic diet as well as other lifestyle changes. And I'll give it to you.
And I'm Siobhan Huggins. I'm the research specialist with the Lipedema Project. My joke is always just that I read stuff and then I talk about it. I'm also the operations manager of Own Your Labs, which is a blood test ordering company. And I'm on the board of 2 nonprofits, one of which is the Citizen Science Foundation, and then also the Lipedema Project, like I just mentioned. And then as a dietary disclosure, which I always like to do, I've been on a ketogenic diet for almost 7 years now, so that does make me a little bit biased, of course. And I do use it to manage my own lipedema at this point, as well as various other mini conditions.
So really quickly, what we're going to talk to you about today. I got part 1 to give you a description of what lipedema is and kind of a rundown of the signs, the symptoms, what are the stages, what are the types of lipedema, and then various management strategies, of which diet is one. And then Siobhan is going to take it over.
Yep, and I'll be talking about keto for lipedema. And with that, I'll be talking about some main focuses for management. So kind of what do we want to focus on when we're working with lipedema in regards to using keto as well. And then I'll also be talking about some of the current research, a little bit of a summary, and then some special highlights on the papers that I think are especially important to know about, because each one has a little bit of something that has some takeaway that I think is interesting.
Okay, so to start with part 1, what is lipedema? And I'm going to be giving you various photographs of women with lipedema, and you will see that there is similarities, but there's many different presentations how someone could look like when they have lipedema. But in general, here is the main symptoms, and we'll be going over each of those symptoms in a little bit more detail. Lipedema occurs almost exclusively in women. There have been men in some papers that have been reported of men having lipedema, but they all had a hormonal disorder that once that was corrected, if it could be corrected, then the lipedema symptoms disappeared. Also it seems to be triggered most often starts during puberty, pregnancy, and menopause. And since women are the ones that go through pregnancy and menopause, we seem to have much more women have that condition. So the most distinguishing feature is that we got that disproportionate deposition of fat mostly to the lower body, typically from the hips to the ankles, but we'll talk about the different distribution. It can happen also in the arms. It pretty much doesn't happen as much in the head, neck, and the trunk, although we are starting to see it now also in especially the lower abdomen. Another feature of it is non-pitting edema. I was just talking to someone beforehand, and she was saying that lymphedema has pitting edema. You press your thumb in and it leaves a depression. Lipedema, you press your thumb in and it just bounces right back out, but you feel that tightness and fullness. So there is edema present, but a different kind of edema. It's very common to have obesity as a comorbidity with lipedema, which can be very confusing because you see someone like this woman and you think she's just obese. And so when she has simple obesity and lipedema, it can be very confusing for her, her family, her healthcare providers. But one thing that can be very different from obesity is that there's a hypersensitivity and can be very severe pain. Not all women with lipedema have the pain, but many do. And it's pain response to things that someone without lipedema would seem innocuous, would seem benign. But for that person, it can be very severely painful. Bruising very easily. Unknown cause of just bruising coming up in the areas where the lipedema fat is. There is skin and tissue changes along with that bruising. There's some other tissue changes that we'll talk about. And then most pertinent to what we're talking about today is that typical weight loss measures do not work with lipedema. So that typical weight loss dieting of low calorie, low fat dieting has no effect on the fat in the areas, the lipedema fat. So you could become very thin and emaciated even in the trunk and the face, but in the lower body where the lipedema fat is, it will have little or no effect. Even bariatric surgery may not have much of effect in the lipedema areas. So it is estimated that 11% of women in the world have lipedema. Most don't know it. Most think they have simple obesity. So that means it could be up to 17 million women in the US and 350 million women worldwide that have lipedema. So this is it's a very pervasive problem. So let's look at the different types. And the types are based on where does the fat get deposited. And so type 1, it's going to be pretty much from the waist, the hips, and the buttocks, so just that area that has the fat being deposited. Type 2, it now goes from the waist to the knees. Type 3, all the way down to the ankles. You can see the feet are not involved. Type 4 is the arms. And in the picture here, it really just shows the upper arms, but you can get it all the way to the wrist. And the arms usually don't happen in isolation. Usually it happens with one of the other types. And so pictured here, you can see that she also has type 3, waist to ankles. And then type 5, she has lipedema in her whole lower body, but the worst of it is in the calves. And so type 5 really states that we've got really a lot in the calves compared to the other parts that have lipedema. And then the stages. So wanted to show you the progression of the condition, stage 1, 2, and 3. This is not all the same woman. So, and you may not necessarily progress to each of these stages. You may be stage 1 your whole life. So, but this is how it looks visually to be stage 1. We'll talk about all the different various characteristics. Oh, and then the laser doesn't work on the TV, so a feature that we don't really need up here. So stage 1 is pretty mild, but you can see that there's a little bit of fat deposit on those legs, and the feet are not affected. Stage 2, a little bit more. Stage 3 is really, goes from moderate to severe, but we get more and more fat deposits, and then you can see in that most severe in stage 3 that her feet are actually swollen. So now it finally starts to affect the feet, and that's where they're going to develop lymphedema with another lymphatic disorder as well. So let's look at some of those symptoms a little bit more in detail. So that disproportionate deposition of fat to the lower body, it is symmetrical, so both legs are going to be affected. Humans generally have a little bit of asymmetry, and so you could have one leg a little bit larger than the other, but in general, you don't get lipedema symptoms only in one leg. It's going to be in both legs. And then the arms could be affected. You can see in the picture that we have here, it's a very obvious difference between her trunk and her lower body. And sometimes that's how it's most recognizable. If you see someone out in the community, it looks like two different bodies, very different on the top to the bottom. So minimal involvement to the head, neck, and trunk, and the hands and the feet are usually not affected. So how do women characterize it? Women who have lipedema, how do they characterize this symptom? So here is some quotes of some women who have lipedema, and they say, my legs have always been bigger than the rest of my body. They just kind of knew something was wrong and different, didn't know what it was. I feel like I have two different bodies, a slim upper half and a very large lower half. I never could wear boots because my calves were always too big, even as a young girl. When I was growing up, go-go boots were the thing, right? and if you had lipedema as a young girl, you could not wear those go-go boots. They did not fit over your calf. So the non-pitting edema. So usually this is what we call orthostatic edema, so meaning that the longer you're upright, gravity is pulling some water down, it's not getting back up. So at the end of the day, in hot, humid weather, you're going to have more swelling. But overnight, when your legs are up in bed, then that swelling is going to go down. Typically, then you'll wake up in the morning with not so much of the water retention. It could also involve lymphedema, so you could get that chronic swelling that just doesn't go down, even after elevating overnight. And so what they're finding is and I think Siobhan's going to talk about this more in her section too, maybe, because you're going to focus more on keto. But what they're finding is the lymph vessels in women with lipedema, they're really dilated, they're enlarged. And because there's that extra fluid that are in their legs, their lymph vessels are trying like crazy to get that fluid out, and so they become dilated. Did you have a question?
On this picture, is there a distinct difference in skin color? It looks like the calves in particular are pinkish, and the feet are normal color.
Mm-hmm. So that can be another distinct characteristic. It also might be a trick of the photo, because sometimes that happens.
Asking, yeah.
But yes, there is not uncommon to have venous issues associated with it, and because the feet are not as affected in the earlier stages, then they're not going to have that discoloration, but you can get that pinkish color because of the venous disturbance. That's a good, excellent point, yes. And so in the earlier stages of lipedema, we do have functioning lymphatics that are actually working faster. They have shown studies that people with lipedema, their lymphatic vessels are transporting the fluid faster than someone without lipedema. In those early stages, they are doing well. But in advanced stages, they're a little bit tired and they become impaired because now we're getting lymphatic failure. They've been trying to keep up with that extra fluid load for so long that they are now ineffective at evacuating the fluid. So how do women characterize this symptom? Maybe they don't realize that they have swelling and water tension, but it feels like my legs feel so heavy by the end of the day. I can gain so much weight in just 24 hours. And if your doctor is telling you that you gained 10 pounds in 24 hours because you're getting more fat, that's not what's happening. That's from water. My legs feel so tight and congested, like they could burst. So that end of the day feeling when you have that maximal water retention really feels tight and heavy. Another very, very common symptom of lipedema is the pain, and it is in those lipedema areas of the body that you have that hypersensitivity to touch. There has been some studies that they use little thin filaments of varying degrees, some only like the thickness of a hair and then going a little bit thicker, and you're not looking while they're touching you in the various parts of the body. And the women with lipedema were more sensitive. They could still feel the very thinnest filaments, whereas the other group without lipedema could not. So they were very sensitive, as well as having that much more pain response. So benign things like, well, for most people, a blood pressure test on your upper arm, it feels tight and maybe uncomfortable, but it can be excruciatingly painful for someone with lipedema. And it fluctuates. So sometimes it hurts really bad and sometimes not so much. Sometimes it could be a burning pain, sometimes it's more of a throbbing pain. So when that changes so much, sometimes it's very hard to quantify and characterize. And it seems to be related to inflammation, which really is one reason why we feel like ketogenic eating is so effective with helping to control the various symptoms of lipedema, because it may be helping to reduce that inflammation. And what women say about pain. This comes from a study that was done in 2008, and they asked women, how would you describe your pain? And it's interesting, when you look at some of these descriptions, it's not a typical descriptor of pain, but it really does sound awful. As though someone were squeezing the blood supply, as though my legs were bursting at the seams, a painful weakness, a raw feeling. I feel weak, as though my legs are bursting. So it can be a very, very painful condition. Let's talk about a few of those skin and tissue changes that can happen. So one is fibrosis, and that is scar tissue, actually, that forms in the soft tissue that can be tethering and binding and restrictive. And so it can give a dimpled-like, mattress-like appearance to the skin. You can see that pictured in this woman's thighs, and also in her lower legs too, but especially in her thighs. And at the dependent areas, so the lower portion, the portion that maybe hangs down at an end of a lobe, that part actually can get very hard. So we have more scar tissue in those areas there can get very firm. And there has been some research that shows when you have that scar tissue in the areas, it actually can resist that fat being burned off and released. It holds the fat in that area. Another characteristic that we can get in the tissue are these nodules, and they're fat scar tissue nodules that can feel like grains of rice, or they can be very large, like walnut or even larger size. So you feel these lumps in the fat tissue. And not all women have that, but sometimes it's just that there's so much other tissue that it's difficult to palpate them. And sometimes they can be, as you lose the lipedema fat, they can be a little bit more obvious and require some other manual techniques to help release those. And then the ankle and wrist cuffing can be another sign of lipedema. This one, you can see it a little bit more obvious. You can see at her ankles where the fat abruptly stops, and then her feet are not affected. So you get that cuff right there. And if the arm is affected, you can have that same appearance at the wrist. And of course, we already talked about that easy bruising. Bruises that just appear in the lipedema areas where we have no idea why they showed up. So how do women describe this? My legs just look so lumpy. So they're looking at their peers, and the skin, the tissue seems smooth, but their own seems lumpy. I feel like my arms are full of rice, because I can feel that grainy feeling in there. It's so hard to get shoes to fit because my feet are small, but my ankles are really big. So really hard to figure out how to get shoes. So let's talk about the resistance to diet and exercise. lipedema was always described, one of the seminal features of lipedema was that diet and exercise have no effect. But a group of us started asking about, well, I don't think they ever tried low carb, high fat. I mean, women with lipedema will try any diet, and they have tried most diets, and it did not have any response. So that was where this statement came from, and this was all over the literature that diet and exercise had no effect, but they weren't describing what the diet was, probably just typical calorie and fat restriction. So in this paper that was written in 2018, after we were discovering how wonderful ketogenic eating was for lipedema, they still were saying what makes lipedema fat unique is that it is resistant to reduction by diet and exercise, called persistent fat. So how do women describe this feature? I've been on every diet and none of them ever worked. I feel so hopeless. Pretty much you give up, right? Because you have tried everything and you've worked really hard, and despite what your doctor said, you are following exactly what he or she has told you to do, and it didn't work. I used to starve myself and exercise for 3 to 4 hours a day, and all I got out of it was an eating disorder. Nothing happened to the lipedema fat. With dieting or even weight loss surgery, it only seemed to affect my stomach, chest, and face. My legs never got any smaller. So this is what women were going through pretty much from puberty to whenever, that it's pretty much was their fault, and nothing worked, and so they would give up. So now we're learning that there is options, there are things that can help, and they need to know that it's not their fault. So what do we do for management strategies? So I'm just going to very briefly talk to you about those things that we're going to do, non-invasive things that we can do, overall program called Complete Decongestive Therapy. A very important part of lipedema treatment is that we have psychosocial support and education. There's now a growing number of complementary therapies, non-invasive complementary therapies that we can do, and also the woman has to do daily self-care strategies to keep ahead of her condition. There are some surgical interventions that can be done, but these need to be done in conjunction with the non-invasive techniques. Too often, I think that people in the United States especially want to go to surgery or a pill. And those are not going to be the best options by themselves. You might need surgery and pills, yes, but you're going to need also those non-invasive techniques. But we have now lymphatic microsurgery that we can do to help the lymphatic system function better. And they have found that liposuction of the lipedema fat areas can also help, but you still need the support of the non-invasive techniques. So just briefly to talk about complete decongestive therapy. It has a decongestion or an intensive phase, phase 1, and that's going to involve a massage technique called manual lymph drainage. It's going to involve exercise, skin care, and compression. And this is usually done on a high frequency over a period of about 3 weeks or so. It is done by someone who has special training in treating, they're usually called a lymphedema therapist, but most of them, not all of them, also know how to treat lipedema, and they will do these same techniques. And then the person is going to move into the maintenance phase, where they're still going to be doing maybe some self-massage, still doing skin care, still doing exercise, and still doing compression, but maybe some not as intense of compression that they were doing in the first phase. And they need to have regular follow-up care. So it's not just a once and done. You need to have regular contact with your certified lipedema therapist. And then the social support and education, important for so many reasons, but really to all of a sudden have the understanding of your peers and validation for what you've been going through, to know that it is a bona fide diagnosis and condition and is not your fault. It helps you to be able to advocate for yourself and others. So it puts that sense of power within you. And to be able to participate in educational opportunities like this. Siobhan and I have talked for Low Carb Denver and other low carb venues, as well as we're speaking at lymphatic conferences and stuff like that. And so that ability to now not only receive support, but to give support to others as that opportunity comes up, it keeps you up to date with research. There has been an explosion in lipedema research just in the last 5 years. It was first coined and noticed in the 1940s at the Mayo Clinic, but pretty much nothing happened on it until about the 1980s, and then nothing happened again until about 5 years ago. So there's been an incredible surge in lipedema research, and you need to stay involved in the communities to know what's new has been discovered. Really important to do self-experimentation, and I think you might be talking a little bit about that, about how, especially with a ketogenic diet, how do you experiment and figure out what's going to be best for you to help manage your condition, and then sharing your experiences as you're learning from your own body and you're sharing with your peers and with experts so everybody can learn and move forward together. I talked a little bit about that there's some complementary treatments. I listed a few of these that are here, but there's much, much more. But any course of treatment with a certified lymphedema therapist could involve these things as well. So you can have the massage, the compression, the exercise, and the skincare, but you might also, if they're versed in it, get some nutritional counseling. You might have what's called cupping, dry needling, myofascial release. These are all different manual techniques. Deep oscillation is a vibration technique. Many women with lipedema might also have pelvic floor issues, and so to get that addressed at the same time will be very, very helpful. And daily self-care, what would that involve? Well, it could be dry brushing, taking Epsom salt baths, water exercise. We got to do that while we were here. Using a pneumatic pump, that's a sleeve that fills with air distally and moving proximally and then releasing, so it's helping to, it's kind of like a mechanical way of doing the massage to help bring the fluid towards the trunk. Using a vibration plate, doing meditation and deep breathing, also very good at activating the lymphatic system. So just a few of those complementary treatments that can, and self-care strategies can really help. And just very briefly on those surgical options, there has been some fantastic papers written on a liposuction by the surgeons themselves. And of course, they're picking their successes. But they have had pretty spectacular reduction in pain, especially, not just the size of the limb, but in pain going down when you remove the pathological fat. Now, we need to now support that with non-invasive treatment so that the fat doesn't just come back. So doing liposuction can be very effective as part of an overall program. Bariatric surgery can help if you also have obesity on top of the lipedema. And then if there is damage and impairment to the lymphatic system, having that lymphatic microsurgery can help. It's really important to make sure that you're not just going to a plastic surgeon who says, oh yeah, liposuction, I do that. I know all about lipedema. Got to make sure that they really do know about lipedema. So getting a lot of opinions on that, carefully weighing those risks and benefits, because any kind of surgery does have risks, and make sure you're feeling like that's going to be something that's good for you. And then if you do decide to do surgery, that you're doing that very good preparation beforehand and follow up with your certified lymphedema therapist afterwards to make sure you have good healing. And I'm going to give that to Siobhan.
Excellent, Leslyn. Thank you so much. All right, so I wanted to focus more on this ketogenic piece because I think when we talk about diet in general, there can be this impulse to say, okay, we're just doing it to lose weight. And we know that is not the case when we're using keto for things like bipolar disorder or depression, epilepsy, all those things. And it's the same sort of thing with lipedema. It's not just about weight loss. Yes, that can definitely happen. I've experienced it. Plenty of others have too. But we're looking at it as a therapeutic diet for this condition. So just a couple of things. What are the management areas that we want to focus on when we're working with lipedema, doing basically anything? So one of them is prevention of further fat gain. We do not want this to progress. We want to stay at a healthy weight as much as possible. And then obesity reversal as well if they also have obesity. And then swelling reduction, of course, if we can help with that, help reduce some of the stress on the system so it doesn't have to work that hard. And then lymphatic support as well. So along with reducing the swelling that's there, can we help the lymphatics work even better? And pain reduction, definitely. Elimination, if possible, is the ideal. And pain has such a massive impact on mobility. If it hurts to move, you're not going to be able to move as much. If it hurts to live, it's not going to be as easy to live. And we want people to be able to live their lives. So focusing on pain reduction is a massive, massive part of this. Maintaining overall health of the tissue. So it's not just that we gain fat and it's like fat in anybody else. There is inflammation within the tissue, there's fluid within the tissue, there's fibrosing, which Leslyn mentioned, so scarring of that tissue. So we do want to make sure that that tissue is as healthy as possible in the hopes that it's going to help prevent some of that scarring and fibrosing. We can keep it happy and working like it should, basically. And then I've also added a bonus here because I'm not sure it's like the standard with lipedema necessarily, though I've seen other researchers mention it, but connective tissue support, which we'll get into. So inflammation first. The cardinal signs of inflammation, I'm sure you've heard of them: pain, swelling, heat, and redness. So we can see a lot of these signs in lipedema tissue as well. So pain, for example, that may be a sign there's inflammation in the tissue. Fibrosis and extensive scarring, like I just mentioned, that can happen as a result of either persistent inflammation or very severe inflammation. So think of getting an injury, the inflammation happens, that can help signal to scar tissue as a protective response, but not fantastic if it's inhibiting function. And then swelling as well. You might not necessarily think of it this way in terms of lipedema, but an interesting aspect is that we can also see swelling flares in terms of food sensitivities, potentially high carbohydrate diets in some people, psychological stress, extreme stress. People may report having flares in this swelling. They suddenly start swelling. Nothing else has changed. It's just because they went through divorce, they went through the death of a spouse, something like that. And all of these are potential inflammatory triggers, which may mean that there may be this component here, which also means we may want to address this to help prevent those flares. So basically reducing that inflammatory environment as much as possible. If inflammation is playing a part here, then if we can reduce other sources of inflammation, that would be super helpful. And as it happens, if the clicker would work, thank you. Ketogenic diets and inflammation, a wonderful pairing. So people sometimes call ketogenic diets anti-inflammatory, and I think one way to think of it is actually non-inflammatory. So the inflammatory triggers that were in the diet are reduced with ketogenic diets in a lot of cases. But there are some other things. We can see probably that aspect in terms of seeing reduced inflammatory markers in some studies, but then also the direct effects of ketones themselves. There seems to be some inflammatory regulating aspect to that, which is interesting. And then reductions in visceral fat, you may not connect that to inflammation, but visceral fat may come about from gut inflammation. And so if ketogenic diets are really good at reducing that, it may suggest it's actually reducing gut inflammation as well. And the lymph has a lot of involvement in the gut. So another aspect of inflammation that we may want to address is metabolic syndrome. High blood pressure, high blood sugar, low HDL, high triglycerides, abdominal obesity, all of that falls into metabolic syndrome. And there's a couple of things here. So one of them is that metabolic syndrome is often linked to low-level chronic inflammation. So if you think about lipedema, we don't want to add additional stressors on top of the problem that they already have. So if we can reverse metabolic syndrome, let's go ahead and do that. At the very least, it's not going to hurt them. And then also, super interesting, but in people with insulin resistance and poor metabolic health, potentially in general, we can see that they may be having a hyperinflammatory response to high carbohydrate foods in particular. So in this study, they were looking at high fat meals, high protein meals, high carb meals. It was the high carb meals that was causing not only a big blood sugar spike when they had it, high insulin spike as well, which may lead to fat storage that may not be fantastic for weight regulation, but also a big spike in inflammation post-meal as well. So in terms of that, if we hear someone talking about, oh, after meals, I feel really sluggish, I feel like my legs feel worse, maybe we should take a look at what they're eating. And by the way, the lean, insulin-sensitive people didn't respond like that to any meal, so this does seem to be a context thing. So there's a ton of papers on ketogenic diets and metabolic syndrome at this point, but I really love this one because this graphical abstract is so beautiful, so easy to understand. Okay, so the top one is the baseline diet, whatever they were used to eating. And we can see that everybody had metabolic syndrome. That's what they wanted in this study. They wanted to look at this group. And then we can see each box is an actual representation of a specific person. So if the person in one box moves over to that corollary box on the other side, they didn't have metabolic syndrome anymore. And so we can see at the very bottom, that's the high carb diet. There's that one dude who did fine with that. Everybody else, not so much. The moderate carb, we got two others joining, that same guy also. And then the low carb group, we saw the most amount of people switching over to no metabolic syndrome anymore. And also that one guy, I don't know what's up with that guy. Maybe what he was eating was just not working for him. But the point of this is that if someone has metabolic syndrome, ketogenic diets are a really powerful tool. If someone with lipedema has metabolic syndrome or any signs of that, this may also work in conjunction to reduce all of those inflammatory triggers, just the stress of having metabolic syndrome in general. And inflammation also impacts the lymphatic system. In some cases, you can think of this as really functional. So if you hit your hand with a hammer on accident, hopefully, if you swell, that's the lymphatic system kind of being affected by that inflammation. That's part of the repair process. But that's also acute, and it will self-resolve once that injury is kind of taken care of. In lipedema, that's not necessarily what we're fully seeing, but it doesn't mean that inflammation can't also impact and make things worse. So again, this is kind of the part of trying to help the lymphatic system work as well as possible, in which case, again, regulating that inflammation in any way we can, including food sensitivities, including stress management, including all of this stuff, may really help reduce that swelling because you're reducing the triggers for making it worse. And persistent swelling is important in lipedema for multiple reasons. Why do we care? Is it just because it feels uncomfortable? Well, no, actually. So part of it is pain, not only the tightness, but there was one study looking at decongestive methods and found that it actually reduced the pain in lipedema, which means that the swelling may actually be contributing to the pain. I don't think we fully understand the mechanisms yet, but the point is if we can help reduce that swelling, we're really helping the person in different ways. The other thing is that fluid stasis within the tissue, so you have that fluid coming in and then it just kind of sits there, that may actually stimulate adipose growth, so fat growth, even absent of excess calories or not moving as much. We've seen this in mice, and then we can also see it in lymphedema, where the same thing happens. You start having that fat accumulation from the fluid in the tissue as well. And again, we want to avoid that with lipedema because that may ultimately result in progression. We don't want that to happen. And the fluid stasis may also contribute to this callousing of the fat. So in terms of fibrosis, I kind of separate it into two categories just to help me think about it. So there's this one that is potentially reversible. We can see it in obesity, and it's this callousing that I mentioned, not as severe. And then we also have this severe scarring of the tissue. We see both in lipedema, but if we can reduce this swelling, we may help with this callousing type, and that may impact some of, losing some of the fat in those lipedema areas if we can get rid of this, if it's in there. And then, the tight and heavy feeling in the legs, we want people to feel happy and energetic and able to live their lives. And so obviously this is an extra bonus point. Connective tissue health. Lipedema is interesting, weird, endlessly fascinating. One aspect of this is that there's multiple components that suggest there might be a connective tissue aspect to this disease, which is like, oh boy. But just a couple of signs here. Increased prevalence of aortic stiffness. In one study, they showed that there was a loss of tissue elasticity, which is, it might actually be important for helping to push the fluid out. So fluid comes in, the tissue is kind of like rubber bandy, the pressure increases, it pushes the fluid back out towards the lymphatic vessels. But if it stretches and then it doesn't rebound, the fluid may sit. And then high prevalence of hypermobility. And this is a fun party game to go through the Baton score, by the way. So 58% in lipedema overall in this study, which is high. So women are more prone to hypermobility. We need to be stretchy when we have babies. But this is still a little bit unusual. The other weird thing about it is in this study, they actually separated it out into the prevalence when it came to stage, so increasing severity of lipedema. And they found that the prevalence of the hypermobility was also increasing with the severity of the stage, up to around 80% in the most severe stage. So strange. The blood vessel abnormalities, so this includes the easy bruising. One researcher speculated that it may be that the connective tissue around the vessels is impacted, and that's why they're bruising easier from that leakiness and then just fragility. Another part of this is Williams syndrome. This is a genetic condition that results in a single copy out of 2 of a couple dozen different genes. One of the other things they experience is the aortic stiffness, but then also 30% of them have a lipedema phenotype. So they have the cuffing, they have the disproportionate fat deposition. They can also develop lymphedema as well as it progresses. They do have some differences. They don't have the easy bruising. And I reached out to some researchers and they said maybe not the nodules either, though there hasn't been a study on that. So some differences, some similarities, but the aortic stiffness that they experience has been speculated to relate to the fact that one of the genes that can be deleted is elastin, which is a component of connective tissue. So this linkage may also lend more towards lipedema having this connective tissue aspect. So what do we want to do about that? Well, connective tissue and nutrition may actually come together, which is good. We can see anecdotally, for example, that people with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and Marfan syndrome even can actually see improvement in their symptoms when they go low carb, keto, or carnivore. That is anecdotal, so there hasn't been a study on it yet. But there was, the vitamins listed on the left side here are from a paper talking about Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and how a lot of the symptoms may link back to or be related to vitamin deficiencies. So the easy bruising could be related to vitamin C, the fatigue related to carnitine, a whole bunch of these different ones. And then there was also a private report from someone that I know. He kindly sent it to me. He speculated similar that connective tissue diseases and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome may also relate to vitamins. So we want to make sure these people are as well nutritioned as possible. Again, it's not going to hurt them, so it is speculative, but on the other hand, what's the downside of making sure someone is eating well? So keto, again, impacts nutrients. I mean, it's food, so that makes sense, but it's more than just the nutrients that you're eating. That definitely is one aspect, so it may increase intake of certain nutrients. It may also encourage the increase in dietary quality overall. People are being more health conscious, eating more nutrient-rich foods, things like that. But it may also impact in a couple other ways. One of them is, again, resolving metabolic syndrome and chronic inflammation. So this may help reduce the need of certain vitamins. For example, folate has been suggested to be linked to inflammation. So folate levels may be driven down when someone has a lot of inflammation going on. I also saw in passing one thing about a type of immune cell expressing more folate receptors, so they may just be eating up more of the supply, which may be why it goes down. It may also help reduce wasting. So if you have insulin resistance of the kidneys, for example, you can start wasting magnesium in your urine, which is not helpful and can lead to deficiency, and we do often see this in type 2 diabetes, for example. And then it may help reduce suppression of levels. So inflammation sends off a huge cascade of signaling stuff, and this can impact a lot of the nutrients that are in play and available. One of them is vitamin D, which you may have noticed was in the previous list. And so if we can supply a good amount of vitamin D in the diet and then reduce that suppression, the levels may come up, and that again may impact these connective tissue symptoms that we're seeing. There's also this nutrient sparing and production aspect. This mostly relates to carnitine and its interaction with vitamin C. So Amber O'Hearn has a fantastic paper talking about carnivore diets and nutrient adequacy, which is actually where I heard about this. But we convert vitamin C to make carnitine, and so if we just supply carnitine, then we spare vitamin C, which is very helpful on a carnivore diet, but may also be helpful in this context. And I would suggest reading her paper too, it's super cool. And then increased production, this mostly relates to folate. So there was a study looking at low-carb diets and fatty liver disease, and they found that despite eating less folate, their serum levels stayed, normal. It's like, where is that coming from? Well, it turns out that the low-carb diet that they were eating was impacting their gut bacteria, and the gut bacteria were producing folate for them. So again, here's another source of folate that we can get. Maybe that is helpful if we're running a little bit low. And then this is an unknown element. I hope it's studied directly, hint, hint, please. But the direct effect of ketones in lipedema is an unknown. There are some research in terms of lymphatic stuff. So ketones impacted lymphatic vessel growth. So if you're having lymphatic impairment, maybe the ketones could help grow some more vessels, get a little bit of backup support. Was in mice, I will caveat. The next one was also in mice, but so this is relating to that callousing type of fibrosis I talked about. We can see this in obesity, including in obese mice. And what happened was when they got their ketone levels up to a certain level, around 3 millimoles, really hard to do for mice, pretty easy for humans, it actually resulted in reversal of that fat fibrosis. So again, potentially, if this is happening in lipedema, maybe this plays into some other things we'll see shortly. And then also, it has been speculated that because of the fluid and just the fat growth in the area, lipedema tissue may have low oxygen, which can impact a lot of things because you need oxygen to do a lot of things. And hypoxia can also signal fibrosis, in case you're curious. That's one of the things. Energy production is a big deal when it comes to oxygen. But ketones help provide a lot of energy for a lower oxygen cost, so you can help preserve the tissue health in that aspect. And there was a paper speculating that ketones may be helpful for any condition where hypoxia is an issue, as long as there was some oxygen, because you do need some to use ketones. Okay, so I gave you a bunch of information. Let's take a pause and digest a little bit. So the basic takeaway is that nutrition can impact a huge wide array of things with lipedema, which is awesome. It is not very often that you get an intervention that not only impacts like one teeny tiny little thing, but a huge part of the disease. So that is very, very good. And the other aspect is that it can work together with other management strategies. So like Leslyn was talking about with surgery, you don't just want to do the surgery, you also want to do the decongestive therapy and hopefully nutrition and a bunch of different things. Same thing with keto. So even with people who are on a ketogenic diet like I am, I still do MLD, I still work compression. I do a lot of things in terms of this complex management. but they work together really, really, really well. And this may impact multiple things: swelling, inflammation, connective tissue, nutrient status, metabolic health. All of those may play a role. And the direct impact of ketones may also play in. We don't know. Remains to be studied. Hopefully it will be. And next I wanted to focus a little bit on the studies on keto for lipedema. How surprised is anyone that there are multiple studies, like not just one, but like half a dozen at this point? It's awesome. So I kind of went through each of them, and I wanted to know what the commonalities were, because replication in science is a big deal. And granted, it's not the same exact thing every time, but this is a ketogenic diet or a low-carb diet being implemented by different teams across the world. What was the crossover that we see? And along with weight loss, that was a commonality. We can also see that in 3 out of 4 of the studies that looked at it, there were thigh circumference reductions. So as Leslyn mentioned, the reduction in lipedema areas, you don't usually see that with diets, but we're seeing it with ketogenic diets. Reductions in hip circumference as well, so that's another potentially impacted area. Reductions in waist circumference, that may actually play into metabolic health, but we're also seeing that, which is good. So you may not only be seeing improvement in lipedema areas, but also, if you also have obesity or overweight, you may see improvements in that too. Additionally, we're seeing improvements in quality of life. So both studies that looked at this saw improvements. And then pain, 3 studies looked at it, 3 studies found improvement in pain from a ketogenic diet. That's a big deal. So let's look at a couple of these. These are like my 3 favorite children, even though I had nothing to do with them. So this is called the Lipodiet study. It's out of Norway. It was kind of one of the first ones, and they decided they wanted to do this kind of pilot trial. So you can see that it is only 9 women. You tend to start out small, see what you can see, and then expand from there. So they did 7 weeks of a ketogenic diet, followed by 6 weeks of calorie matched standard Nordic fare. That was around 200 grams of carbs. So kind of ketogenic diet and then high carb diet. The other interesting thing about this is that they actually made the ketogenic diet to not induce weight loss in these women. They lost 10 pounds anyway, which I find kind of funny. So they did see that reduction in hip circumference. That's one of the studies in the previous slide. The interesting aspect about this is that they saw reductions in pain from the ketogenic diet. They flip over to the Nordic diet, which is a high carb diet, and the pain returned to baseline levels, but they didn't gain weight. So it seems like with the ketogenic diet, the pain reduction aspect may not be related to weight loss. And I kind of like to flip that a little bit and thinking if there is someone with lipedema who is actually already very thin, maybe they don't actually need to lose weight, even if they have that fat deposition in lipedema areas, they may still benefit in terms of pain reduction. Okay, next up, this was the study from surgeons that Leslyn mentioned. And this is a case series, so not a controlled trial or anything like that, but they're reporting kind of what they saw in their own practice that they felt was novel. And in this case, they were talking about kind of between a low carb and keto spectrum. So anti-inflammatory, low carbohydrate or ketogenic diets were used. Manual lymph drainage was also used, antioxidant supplementation, and then aquatic exercise. So again, they were getting that comprehensive care going on. And what they found, I mean, just look at the pictures. This is before surgery, and then the last one is after. And the reason I like to focus on this one, again, improvement in quality of life, but if you feel like surgery is right for you, then you can still get your body in the best shape as possible before you undergo that trauma, and you can reduce potentially the amount you're going to need to take out from that liposuction, so that's less of a stressor as well. And then you can go into the surgery in your best health possible, get that done, and then go back on this supporting diet, all of that stuff, and imagine how much of a difference that is on the body compared to going in blind. And they actually say in this paper, surgery should not be done in lipedema during the inflammatory phase. They actually want people to do this because it means better outcomes, an easier time of it, it's gentler on the body. So again, when we're looking at different modalities that we can use, including surgery, it is part of a larger piece that we want to make sure we're taking care of. This one is interesting because it's looking at low carb, high fat versus moderate carb, moderate fat. And it's like, okay, is it, what is it about the ketogenic diet? Can we get as good results with just lowering carbs a little? In this one, both groups actually did see improvements. So you can see reductions in visceral fat, reductions in percent body fat, reductions in weight, reductions in measurements, all of this stuff. But the ketogenic diet group did better. And I don't want to use this study to say, and ketogenic diets are your only option because anything else is subpar. No, instead I look at this like, and if you reduce carbs a little bit, you can still get improvement. So this is actually an excellent stepping stone. If you're not ready to go into keto off the bat, if that's overwhelming for you, if you've gone through a gajillion diets already and you just do not want to do that again, you can take little steps and still see things improving. That's what I like to focus on with this one. And that is typically what we see as well. And oh, by the way, I'll point out, this is very low carb. So they say low carb. Low carbon studies can be like anything, but this was actually about ketogenic levels. So again, and then onto the recap again. So ketogenic diets, ketogenic therapies are really powerful for lipedema. Are they for everyone? I don't think so. I don't think everybody needs it, but I think it should be discussed and offered to people off the bat to say there is evidence for this. There's a lot of evidence for this. Anecdotal case series, studies, just implementing it and seeing improvement again and again and again. This is consistent. The lower the carb, the more effective. That seems to be, I mean, this is an initial study, so it would need to be repeated in bigger numbers and all of that. But interestingly, we do also have some people in our community who went carnivore even after they were keto and still saw more improvement. So maybe relating to the carbs, maybe relating to just food sensitivities, nutrition, bioavailability, tons of stuff with carnivore. But yeah, we do see that even to that point. We see lots of improvements in a lot of things, primarily weight, measurements, pain, quality of life, and one study also indicated they did see improvements in swelling as well from keto, so that's important to mention. And then anecdotally, from the ketogenic lipedema communities that we have, we do often hear about improved swelling, fewer flares, less intense, less of that bursting at the seams feeling. We hear about talking about improved tissue texture, so their fat is softer and more jiggly like fat should be, less fibrosis in the tissue basically. Improvements in fatigue, so that's another one that pops up with lipedema a lot. And we can see improvements in that, improvements in brain fog, improvements in mood. So imagine, imagine having a chronic condition and then also struggling with chronic depression. Not an easy thing to do, but the good news is that ketogenic diets are also being studied for things like depression, bipolar, all of those other things that can make your life a gajillion times more complicated. Metabolic Mind is doing a ton of stuff into it if you want to look into it at all. But we're seeing it in lipedema patients as well. And final takeaways. Keto is powerful. It's awesome. I get super excited about it because I am very grateful to have been diagnosed early, to be able to catch it early. At the time, I was already on a ketogenic diet for like 6 years, 5 years, I guess. But I know so many other women who are only diagnosed in their 60s and 70s. And with the management tools that they had been using, if they had access to any, there was such a struggle, a loss of hope, a feeling like there's nothing you can do, it's walking uphill, and then comes along keto and holistic care and compression and MLD and all of it working together, and suddenly they have hope again. Suddenly, they're not in pain all the time anymore. Suddenly, they're seeing the ability in themselves to start working on mobility again. I know someone who went from being in a wheelchair from lipedema to having to relearn how to walk. That's a big deal. So this is a big deal. And this includes, again, surgery, pre and post care. We want the body to be as healthy as possible when we're doing anything surgery related, and this can be one component of that, along with other management steps. So I think in general, what we tend to see in our community is that focuses should be on non-inflammatory foods. So if you have metabolic health problems, a lower carb diet may be a good idea. And then also looking for food sensitivities on an individual level. So plenty of people have issues with nightshades, blueberries, eggplant, stuff like that, tomatoes. Dairy comes up pretty often. Nuts. Yeah, I saw that look. Dairy is such a trigger topic, but a lot of people do have issues with it. Not everybody, so you might be in the clear. And it should be individualized to the person. And then high quality nutrition overall. So we want these people to have the best access to vitamins, minerals, high quality protein, high quality energy that they can actually use to help them feel their best and get their body in the best shape possible. And keto may be optimal, the most evidence-based in terms of highest, outcome, but I think lowering carbs in general can be a really, really good way to start. And then just improving food quality overall, decreasing glycemic exertions, just baby steps, whatever you're comfortable with. All an excellent place to start. And if you need any help, any resources, anything, please do not hesitate to reach out. You can contact us here, and we're always there for you if you need it. Thank you. All right,
Okay,
questions.
so we're going to have questions. Travis is going to be running around, and Joel probably, with microphones for anybody who's here that wants to answer a question so that the people at home can hear it. But I have a question, or rather a clarification. When we first started talking with you guys, I kept on thinking I was misunderstanding lipedema and lymphedema. And I was, what is the difference between those two? Can you answer that?
Sure. And I actually started this journey in just in lymphedema. I did a little pilot study with patients who had lymphedema and obesity and had them use a ketogenic diet. Because lymphedema is either an inborn or due to trauma, an assault and impairment to the lymphatic system. Typically, it happens in this country because of cancer treatment. So you have lymph nodes removed, or you have radiation treatment that can impair the remaining lymph nodes or the lymphatic vessels. And now the way to get fluid out of a body area is impaired. And so, for instance, with breast cancer, if you remove the lymph nodes under the arm, then everything that drains to those nodes can become swollen. And that is basically to the middle of your chest, to your waist, all the way around the back, and including the arm. All that area can have a backup of fluid and become swollen. But people can also be born with too few nodes or non-functioning lymphatics. And so that person could just be born with this impaired lymphatic system that maybe not appear until, what a coincidence, puberty seems to be a big trigger for even lymphedema as well as lipedema. But you can at birth also see a swollen body part. And so lymphedema and lipedema have a different trigger, whereas lymphedema starts as a swelling problem. And then we collect fat in the area that has the swelling problem. Whereas lipedema seems to start with a pathological fat problem that then also encourages the accumulation of fluid. And when we get those two things together, they seem to have a vicious cycle that builds on each other, and you get more and more swelling and more fat deposit until you interrupt them with the proper treatments. And nutrition is just a huge part of the proper treatment for both lymphedema and lipedema.
Thank you for this presentation. It was fabulous. Question on hereditary. Have we been studying lipedema and hereditary factors? And can you speak to that?
Would you like to take that, Siobhan?
Yeah, so there does appear to be the possibility of a genetic component with lipedema, because when we look at it, it's not uncommon to see one person with lipedema, and then we look up through their family, and there's others with lipedema in that family as well. In terms of specific genes, there's no lipedema gene that's been identified yet. There's been some that have been singled out as potential follow-up points. One other researcher suggested we're not going to find one because it may be a cluster of genes that are interacting. So yeah, it does seem likely. I think it is likely that lipedema does have a genetic component and that it's being influenced by the surrounding environment. But we don't have anything like, no 23andMe, put it through Prometheus, oh, it's that one, you have it. We just don't have that yet.
If there isn't a lymphedema gene, is there a lipedema compression garment? Sorry, bad joke.
Yes, there are many, in fact.
I think we have someone down here. So you gotta get the microphone.
So when you're distinguishing between keto and low carb, so I'm pretty sure my daughter has it because I have lipedema also. And she just had a baby, and yeah, she can't lose the weight no matter what she does. And I can just see she has the same profile that I did as a young girl. But she absolutely will not try keto. No. So how low carb, if I could just get her to do low carb, like how low of carbs would you suggest?
Yeah, if you can get her to reduce any carbohydrates, and like what I would suggest is to start with, for instance, pick something that she eats a lot that's a high carb. Pick that food and say, do this for 30 days, and she will have a response in that 30 days that will make her want to continue. When you have a reduction in pain, if you just don't feel so tight and heavy and swollen, even if it's just a little bit of a response, you notice it and it is motivating. So, you know, maybe in her situation, not to say you have to get to at least 100 grams or less of carbohydrates. I mean, that might be the kind of thing that might say, no, I'm just not going to do it. What do you suggest, Siobhan?
Yeah, so the moderate carb study, just for reference, a standard American diet can be anywhere around like 300 grams of carbs per day. The moderate carb was 200 grams, and they were already seeing improvement from that amount of reduction.
And that's a lot of carbs.
And that's still pretty high carb. And then low carb around 100, and then keto somewhere below that, usually 20 to 50-ish. So anywhere in that spectrum, it seems like we are seeing improvement. And then, like I said, it's not to say keto is the only option, so don't bother if you're not going to do it. But another thing that can be focused on, reducing some of those carbs, reducing sugary carbs, you know, the sodas, for example, is a good step. Yeah, cold cereal, the grains, stuff like that. And focusing on just improving dietary quality overall. And I think one thing that can come up, especially in younger kids nowadays, is anti-diet culture, which I empathize with a lot. And so instead approaching it with a very gentle and empathetic way, trying to feed your body in a way that's going to feel good, and hopefully reducing carbs along the way, because we do have evidence that's going to help. But then also focusing on whole foods, focusing on keeping carbs towards the end of the meal, focusing on not eating in between meals. There's a ton that you can do to improve without necessarily having to go keto right away. And hopefully that will help her.
There was a fabulous study that was not looking at lipedema, it was just looking at pain. And they had, it was a pretty good size of sample size, but they had everybody just go to a whole foods diet, not saying what carbohydrate level or anything, just everybody was eating whole foods. So they still had, you know, they would still have whole grain breads, but they would have not buy a fruit salad with a sugar sauce on it. They would eat the fruit. So it was just a whole food diet. And then they had that group split up into keto and continue with whole foods. and they wanted to see what impact it had on their pain level. And all the participants had a chronic pain disorder, and so they measured their pain. So the people who just went whole food had a reduction in pain. It just wasn't as good as the keto group did. So, so even just, whatever she sees as healthy foods, it might be completely plant-based. Right. But even just not having anything that comes out of a box and just having whole foods could be a start. And when she has success with that, maybe she'll want to go do something more.
Since this one.
Is this, there we go. Has anybody looked into the effects of sugar composition on some of what you're looking into? The point that I'm getting to is that fructose and glucose are physiologically very, very different in the body. The one concern, glucose, we all know what it does, okay? Many people, though, are not yet aware that fructose is metabolized in the liver. One of the immediate products is glyceraldehyde, and it acts like an aldehyde on tissues, just like acetaldehyde and formaldehyde. So it's toxic, okay, and immediately toxic. Has anybody looked into the differences and separated fructose on the one hand from a non-fructose but moderate carb diet?
And I would say that as far as lipedema is concerned, something like that Polish study they did the high carb or the moderate carb and the ketogenic diet and compared those results. The people in the ketogenic group didn't have fruit. They didn't have fruit juice. So they were inadvertently looking at that just because on a standard ketogenic diet, you don't eat fruit. You just have non-starchy vegetables. So, right. So I think they had a massive reduction in exposure to fructose, and that may be an inadvertent conclusion that we might think that it seems that, that healthy, fresh squeezed orange juice maybe wasn't so good for you. Yeah. Comments?
Didn't you also come across a study about fructose in lymphatics at some point, or am I misremembering?
Yes, I mean, there was in animals, but they were looking at, they wanted to see the impact of metabolic syndrome on the lymphatics in mice. And they figured out, what is the best way to give mice metabolic syndrome? Let's feed them a high fructose diet. And so the effect on the lymphatics on the mice that were eating a high fructose diet was astounding. Their lymphatics became so inflamed that the transport capacity of those vessels was reduced by 50%. So I do think that's further evidence that the fructose has quite an impact.
Yeah, and then in terms of acute impacts on lipedema, I've seen people react to fruit for sure, but then also starchy carbs as well. So it seems like in general, the carbs may be an issue for a lot of people, but the fructose aspect should probably be investigated as well. But I haven't seen anything in terms of lipedema specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, you mentioned in one of the early slides humidity and things like that. Does external, or what correlation does external environment have as far as like living in Florida versus Utah?
Yeah. And it's tremendous. I mean, we do, heat in general can cause a lot of us to swell. But it seems like someone who has an impaired lymphatic system, who has lymphedema or lipedema, to be in heat and humidity, it seems to be a much more severe reaction. And this is, I'm just seeing anecdotally from my patients and my practice. So I don't know that there's really been like a clinical trial to quantify that, but it's just been my experience that Phoenix versus Florida is going to have a completely different impact.
Yeah, and
and go scuba diving.
Yes.
Yeah, and just for me personally.
Same vein.
Yeah, go ahead.
What about though altitude?
Yes.
Because, for example,
Good
you know,
point.
Dave and I will go down to California. We drive down there,
Yes.
and my lymphedema and lipedema symptoms seem to be so much better. I go to Disneyland, I'm walking, I'm doing great. Nothing's swelling up. I'm doing my compression. I'm swimming every day, right? Then the drive home, before I'm even halfway there, my
Yes.
legs are swollen. I'm putting my feet up. I'm dying. I can't even move by the time I get home. Back
Which
to
is,
Utah.
it's multifactorial because also on the drive home, you're being immobile. And the two things that, yeah, yeah. And so it is multifactorial, but I think that, yes, the altitude, so people need to wear compression when they fly or if they're used to living at sea level and then they move to Denver. So that, and as well as the climate, the humidity. You had another comment.
Yeah, so in terms of the heat and humidity, for me, it's really bad. It's funny because when I went in for the diagnosis, the diagnosing physician asked, like, do you get heat-induced edema? And I was like, well, I don't know. I try not to go out into the heat because I'll get nauseous and feel like I'm being strangled. And she's like, okay, yes. So, and yeah, my feet will blow up, my legs will start aching, so I have to make sure I'm wearing compression and, if possible, just staying as cold as humanly possible, preferably like popsicle level. But yeah, in terms of the community, we've definitely seen the heat-induced edema quite a bit, and then pressure fluctuations, so plane travel, changing altitude, things like that. And storms is a weird one that has popped up recently in terms of causing leg ache, brain fog, all of that type of stuff. We're seeing
Barometric
that.
pressure, yeah.
Yeah.
Hello, I came into keto because I had a diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis. And I saw a lot of help with my inflammation when I upped my level of my vitamin B and I was really low in vitamin D. And also when I started getting rid of the sugar and the carbs, but also when I started to fast. That seemed to take a lot of my inflammation down. Have they studied fasting with lipedema and lymphedema for getting rid of inflammation?
Yeah, and they have not studied long-term fasting. They have, there's been some studies with lymphedema with humans and ketogenic diets, which tend to lend itself to intermittent fasting. But they have not looked at either of these conditions yet with fasting that I know of. Do you?
So I do know of someone who does use fasting in their clients with lipedema, and they have found that it is useful. The caveat is they're often using ketogenic and low-carb diets in combination. But of the women with lipedema that I know, fasting can sometimes be useful in terms of reducing the swelling and things like that, kind of giving the body a break. I'll find that even to the level of like one meal a day being more beneficial over multiple meals in terms of the swelling that I see in my ankles and legs. One caution I would put forward though is there can be this kind of thing of if you have body fat, you don't need to worry about it. You can fast however long you want because you have so much energy. With lipedema, that is not necessarily true, and you don't know to what extent. So for me, I found fasting to be super, super easy when I was obese. Like, wow, I could do this for like a week, no problem. And then when my waist size started normalizing, it got increasingly more and more difficult. I started feeling cold during extended fasts. I started feeling fatigue, trouble sleeping, just all sorts of messed up. And it is very possible for me that the functional fat that I have is no longer enough to support a fast. So if someone wants to experiment with fasting and lipedema, I think that's fine, preferably medically supervised just in general. But then also pay really, really close attention to how you're feeling and pay attention for those signs that you may not be getting enough energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Lisa.
So I come from a gastric bypass 22 years ago. So I find that nutritionally, the supplementation is really hard because no matter how much I take, it doesn't do anything. That's why it's called a malabsorption surgery for a reason, right? So I'm wondering, in there it said that gastric bypass could be one of the things to help with obesity, but then you have this dual thing where after you have a gastric bypass, you can no longer absorb your vitamins and minerals.
Yes.
So how do you do that?
Yeah, I'm always in favor of using a nutritional fix rather than a surgery fix for obesity, but sometimes there are other complexities to a person's condition that make it necessary that we need to find a faster fix. And so that could be something that is necessary in some people, but I think in general, I would try to avoid bariatric surgery if I could, if there were other options. But sometimes there's not. So, and I understand that it needs to be something that is available, but I wouldn't have it be the go-to, the first thing in the majority of the cases.
Would you take more just to get that?
So the people that I know who've had bariatric surgery and are having issues with that, they'll either do IV
Yeah.
to
Get it
just
right into the
bypass the
blood.
gut entirely, and then for some things, like B vitamins, there's sometimes sublinguals. Yeah, so that's usually what I see is they're bypassing gut absorption.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Oh yeah, sublingual is under the tongue.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. We're going to end the live stream, and then we'll say goodbye. Bye. There you go.
Bye.